Hello and welcome to the School Safety Free Period. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
We're the founders and directors of the Educator School Safety Network. We're a national nonprofit and we provide educator-focused school safety professional development, resources, and technical assistance for K-12 schools throughout the United States and Canada. You can find us and our work at www.eschoolsafety.org. In our daily work as trainers and researchers, we typically take a fairly studious approach to the critical work of school safety and violence prevention. However, in this, our school safety free period, we're a little less formal, we're a little less academic, and a little bit more fun. We examine school safety issues and current events in a more informal, conversational fashion. So, what do you have for us today, Dr. Klinger?
Well, I don't have an article today. I think instead I would like to talk a little bit about a trend.
Okay.
Trends tend to, I think, give you a thought or an indication of potentially where something might be going. But I also think it gives you an opportunity to examine that just because a trend is happening doesn't mean it's right or wrong. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about, I've been seeing a lot in the reading and the things that I consume, if you will, related to school safety and schools in general. Been seeing sort of an increasing trend of concerns. I don't want to use the word pushback because I'm not sure that we're at that point, but of concerns that are being raised in terms of the application of restorative practices or restorative justice. And I know that this raises the hairs on the back of a lot of people's neck because schools have worked very diligently to look at alternatives to, discipline, the whole conversations about the school to prison pipeline, the whole idea of exclusionary discipline and all of those kind of things. And so I think it's important to set the stage that this conversation we want to have is not about proving or saying we should or we shouldn't, but rather to look at the notion of really anything done too much, too far, to the extreme at the expense of something else is always going to potentially garner criticism and pushback.
Well, and I think also potentially a concern about implementation with fidelity or not.
Well, and that's what I think is interesting about these conversations I'm seeing more and more about restorative practices. I can remember the first restorative practice workshop that I went to was probably maybe 2010. So it was quite some time ago. And it was one of those things where you went, yes, this is absolutely what we need. We need for people to understand how their behaviors impacted other people. We need for people to make it right. And, you can probably attest as a parent, that was always something in my parental discipline there's not just a consequence. There's also the need for, what's the word I want? For making it right, but for, restoring.
Restorative.
No, for restoring the order. I wanted to say, what is it when, not compensatory, but what's the word that you go, well, like when you're penalizing someone and they have to pay for what they broke. What's it called?
Compensatory damages?
Yeah, is that the legal? Okay,
Yeah.
well, I don't want to go into the legal stuff anyways, but I think that's sort of a notion. But where I'm curious to see, and I honestly don't know one way or the other, so I think our listeners could probably speak to this better, is like everything in education, has the pendulum gone too far to the other side, and or have we lost sight of the value of combining both accountability and consequences with restorative elements or restorative practices? And some of the things that you see where this has become problematic, one in particular where it was a physical assault, and the restorative practice was to bring the two together and have the kid talk to the aggressor and the aggressor talk to the kid, and the parents were upset because the kid felt very unsafe being put in the same space as the kid that had just attacked him in an unprovoked manner. And when you and I were talking about this before, last week, you raised a really excellent point that if we have a a physical altercation where both students were involved, then clearly that would make more sense to bring those two together and to work through this, but also enact a consequence for fighting in school. But in this particular case, it's almost like it went too far. Like the only tool we had was a hammer. So we're going to continue to put these two people in a room and tell them to work it out. And we saw that a few years ago with a lot of the stuff with bullying, where they would put the victimized kid and the bully together and go, okay, work it out. Well, or the aggressor and the victim together, work it out. Well, I was, injured in an unprovoked attack. I don't have anything I need to work out.
Right.
And I think that's where we start to stray into areas that are counterproductive to restorative practice.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I ask about the implementation with fidelity, because some of the examples that you're giving remind me of a lot of other things that we do in schools and a lot of things that we do in school safety, which is, I don't know why we do this thing, but we, especially like, I never was at the training, but I know we're supposed to do this thing, and I don't really know why, and I don't really understand it. So you attacked a kid, and I'm going to have you work it out, even though this was not a fight. This was, and not even like an attack, but like, I think you gave the example of like, I shoved you down the slide because I was really in a rush to go down the slide. The kid that got shoved down the slide doesn't really have much. And again, I mean, I have to, I have not been trained or received a ton of information in restorative practices, but my presumption would be that in that instance, there's not a ton for that kid, the shovee, to bring to that. And so I guess the concern would be is, obviously we understand, post-COVID, even before, educators are overtaxed, educators are stretched very thin. So it's pretty logical to be concerned that there might be a little bit of cutting corners. There might be a little bit of like, right, I got to do something about this, and I'm supposed to do this thing, whether it makes sense here or not, or whether there needs to be a lot of pre-work to make it effective or not.
And that's what we used to do with exclusionary discipline. We would go, well, it doesn't make sense to bounce you out of school, but that's what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
And we just would remove kids from school. Now we're doing the same thing on the other side of the coin, which is, well, it doesn't make sense to put the two of you in a room, but that's what we're supposed to do.
Those are the only tools that I have at my disposal.
Right. And that's what concerns me about it is I think there is the real potential that you're going to lose the good parts of restorative practices because you implemented them in a haphazard or not very strategic way, and or you didn't couple with it the accountability and the consequence that people are looking for.
So the question that I asked you, and that I think I'll pose again here, is if the concern is exclusionary discipline, right? If the bulk of the research about the disproportionate impact on students of color, if the concern about like you mentioned, the school to prison pipeline, if the concern is focused not exclusively, but mostly around exclusionary discipline, meaning suspension and expulsion, does that mean that other lower forms of discipline that do not involve exclusion, such as the removal of privileges, such as, I don't know, Saturday school, if that's still a thing, but things that are not excluding, but that are still a discipline consequence, are those as much of a concern? And if not, isn't there a lot of room for other types of discipline consequences that are not a simple suspension and expulsion?
Well, I think there's a whole host of things that play into that. One is alternative forms of discipline tend to be more expensive. I'll just be honest. They tend to have you need to have more staffing. You need to have, levels of expertise maybe that people don't have in terms of supervision or that kind of thing. I think that there is the uncomfortable reality that oftentimes, depending on the state or the district, you have to submit data about how many kids you have removed or expelled or done some disciplinary consequence to. And you don't have to report how many kids you did a restorative circle with. So there is the tendency to want to go into the area that is not reported. Now, I'm sure that may be different depending on the state or the school. And then some of it is also the efficacy of either approach.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that, what research I have seen on both sides, neither one of them is a slam dunk of like, oh yeah, that works 100% of the time. It doesn't. It is very individualized, and like everything else in school safety, it is very relationship based.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I liked about restorative practices, that I like about it, is that it tends to have the response fit the infraction more than to say, well, you did A, so I have to do B, whether it makes sense or not. But I will also say that as an administrator, I had some latitude to be able to have the consequence or the accountability fit the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So if you trashed the cafeteria, it wasn't that I put you out of school the next day, it was you cleaned it up.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what we have gotten away from. We have gotten away from the accountability and or the restorative element that fits the situation, as opposed to just, if you do A, I have to do something, so I'm going to do D.
Well, and it sounds like that sort of a narrowly tailored discipline consequence, probably a little bit more complicated to do than,
It's more complicated to do. It's harder to codify. Is that the word I want? To put in your policy and procedure.
Uh-huh.
It's easier for parents to push back. My kids shouldn't be cleaning up garbage in the cafeteria.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody has to make sure it happens with fidelity. And so, yeah, you have like all these.
Well, and it takes a lot more. It takes a lot more cognitive or emotional labor, because you're designing or developing or even just choosing something, as opposed to what you're talking about. If X, then Y. And whether Y is exclusionary discipline or an empty exercise resembling a restorative practice, it is just a lot simpler to go if X, then Y, as opposed to if trash the cafeteria, then stay in from recess or stay in from a fun thing and clean it up. You're right. It is a lot more complicated.
I'll throw into the mix just to make it more complicated. One being that, we have educators that struggle with classroom management, with managing behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And because we've got behaviors that are way, oftentimes way more extreme than perhaps they were a generation or two ago. So the whole notion of controlling behavior, modifying behavior, examining behavior is much more complex than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And people aren't quite as well equipped to do it. So I think that's part of it. And then I think there is also a hesitancy, which I think is very detrimental, a hesitancy to hold kids accountable, both on the part of parents and on the part of, therefore, the school, that we have much more of a victim mentality, which I don't think does kids any good at all. I think that being faced with what you did and making it right and having to explain and examine and think about how the other person felt, all those being restorative, makes a ton of sense. But you can't just go, oh yeah, I bet that didn't feel good when I shoved you down the slide. There also has to be a consequence or accountability that couples with it. I think our problem is we have uncoupled them, and we have chosen one or the other instead of.
Well, so I guess if you are, observing data that tends to indicate a trend of parents being concerned and pushing back on the current state of play of discipline, I will tell you, I read a couple of different subreddits that are teachers, and there is a pretty consistent drumbeat of this feeling that administrators won't allow there to be true discipline consequences for behavior. Now, I'm not saying that that's true, but that is a feeling. And so then there is sort of this notion of lots of people have lots of gripes about the state of play of
And nobody
discipline.
wants to be the bad guy.
Right. And so how do we move forward out of this, because I mean, it seems like there is going to be some uncomfortable change, whether that is uncomfortable for the adults or uncomfortable for the kids, in terms of there's going to be consequences and it's going to be uncomfortable.
And I think we reach a tipping point where a couple of things potentially happen. One is you have more people who feel that there's not been adequate consequences for something that happened to their kid. So somebody did something to my kid and I'm upset that there were no consequences.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're going to have kids who are going to move into an arena, i.e. society, where there is not going to be a restorative discussion when you've done a certain criminal behavior or some, so I think there's going to be that uncomfortable transition.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think there is also what we see from teachers, and we hear from teachers all the time. They don't feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
And the kids don't feel safe. And they're going to do something. They're going to vote with their feet. They're either going to leave the profession or leave that particular building. That kid is either going to engage in some other, way for his education. And so I think you're right. There is a tipping point where we can't just keep doing one extreme. And I feel like we say this all the time, but that center approach tends to almost always be a more sustainable, more effective way, whether you're talking about, discipline, or you're talking about supervision, or you're talking about curriculum, whatever it is. The more we get into one thing at the expense of the other, the more problematic we're going to have. The more problems we're going to have. I didn't say that right.
So we definitely haven't solved it, but I think it's a good first step to kind of think critically of what does this look like in your school. If it's working, my goodness, please tell and share. If you have something that's working well, please share that, and we can kind of amplify the voice of that. And if not, to kind of have a little bit of an examination of what's happening. What are the factors at play? What are the obstacles that make it difficult for us to implement, restorative practices with fidelity? What are the concerns? Is it a training concern? People have lost sight of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. There isn't the time or space to do the things that we're actually trying to accomplish. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can always shoot us an email, info@eschoolsafety.org. Do you have anything you want to close with?
I think the big takeaway for me is that and maybe it's easy for me to say because I see the value in both approaches. I think the big takeaway for me is that we have got to start having conversations that examine the pros and cons of things instead of just, I can scream louder than you, and so therefore my approach gets implemented without any discussion or examination. And this has been around long enough, as has exclusionary discipline, that there is more research on the effectiveness. And we know anecdotally more, and we know more what people think. So I think the big takeaway for me is let's not just go, oh, no, we can't question exclusionary discipline. Or no, we can't question restorative practices. Yeah, we can. And by questioning, we can improve them both. And I think that for me is the takeaway.
Well, thank you for joining us on this episode of the School Safety Free Period. Please connect with us via social media. You can find links in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. Also, make sure that you check out the free resources and all of the other information about our organization and the work that we do. Our website, again, is www.eschoolsafety.org. So until next time, thanks.